Have you ever wondered how intellectual empathy and is connected to intersectionality? You may also be wondering what this has to do with you and DEI. Maureen Linker, a philosophy professor at the University of Michigan Dearborn, developed intellectual empathy after more than a decade of teaching critical thinking in metropolitan Detroit, one of the most racially and economically divided urban areas at the crossroads of one of the Midwest's most prominent Muslim communities. When you think of intellectual empathy, that is what it looks like. Intellectual empathy entails knowing and recognizing our inclinations, blind spots, biases, and social identities. And what does that mean? It means learning about ourselves and knowing who we are while empathizing with others' circumstances. Doing so within the framework of intellectual empathy helps us more deeply consider the lived realities of those various intersections. Hannah Hassler quotes that in an article she wrote in Medium. We are excited to have you with us today. I'm looking forward to you all meeting my guest. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience as possible. I'm eternally grateful to all of our loyal guests. Every week we create new content, and we look forward to you following us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm an DEI personal consultant and EQ coach. And today with us is Holly Noon, a trailblazer in her own right. I will let you introduce her. She will introduce herself in her unique way. Hi, Holly. How are you?
Hi, Rochelle. It's great to be here. I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
It's so nice to see you. I'm so happy you've joined us today. If you can
Yeah.
tell the audience a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Yeah. So, from my personal background, I am biracial. So, my mother is Filipino and my biological father is African American. And I was adopted where my mom ended up marrying my, I call my dad, who is white. So I had a biological black father, but the father that raised me is white with my Filipino mother. And then, so I grew up in a household of biracial siblings. So myself being black and Filipino and having brothers who are white and Filipino. And so my family is very diverse racially and ethnically, but also there is other identities, whether there are people who are neurodivergent, veterans, have served in the military, people of the, individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. I would say a very diverse background from a personal standpoint. And professionally, I have been in the HR and DEI space for about 12 plus years. So whether that's leading employee resource groups or just consulting, training, I love everything DEI. And so that's what brings me here today.
That's amazing. And how do you identify yourself then? Mhm.
so so I so I typically identify myself as so as a kid, I used to identify, interesting enough, as Asian because like the two or more races boxes didn't exist like that in the early 90s. It was kind of your this, that was it. But as time, and that was only because I really could only identify from visually seeing as my mother, who was being Filipino, so just saying Asian, and my mom is also brown, so she's like actually not much, like she's a little lighter than me, but not by much. And so most people growing up just thought I was black. They'd be like, "Oh, you must be from the Caribbean." And so that's kind of where, even though I might put Asian on paper, people didn't see like that because I didn't look like lighter skin, like my eyes, like what they assumed like an Asian person should look like.
Right.
But as I got older, like into high school, I because everyone just assumed I was black, that's kind of how I identified, was just more connecting in that way. It was just like, oh yeah, I'm black. And then I would tell people, hey, by the way, my mom is Filipino and all these kind of things. But if visually to them, that's what you look like, you get lumped in that category. So even teachers didn't even know I was Asian. They just assumed I was
Black.
Black. That's just
Right.
like what it was. Like they just, if, and especially going to a school that did not have a high percentage of Black students in general, it's like if you're the only one in like honors or AP classes, you get lumped with everybody with darker skin,
Com-
brown skin. And so as I've gotten older, I do identify as two or more races now, but I'll say like it was for the most part, if people are like, "Oh, you're Black," I kind of just, okay. That's like, I don't, because I understand like from a visual standpoint
Right.
that without me having to almost like explain like there are brown Asians and like, people, they're also lighter African American people or African descent people, like people of African descent. So I think sometimes I don't want to explain that it's like, yeah, because then I've had people be like, there's no way you're Asian. You look like, you're so brown. And I'm like, there's brown Asians that exist, like it doesn't have to be like this one fit in the box
Absolutely.
convention. Yeah. So
Absolutely. So how do you navigate then? How do you navigate? Do you stop explaining? Like you said, you're just tired of explaining. I don't like to explain. I just say I'm
yeah.
Haitian. And then the question's like, "Oh, but you're so light." And I
Yep.
think and I say, "Yeah, well, Haitians come in various shades of brown."
Yeah.
Oh, well, the Haitians we know, and then they go down the list.
Yeah. I know they go down the rabbit hole.
Right. And then you find yourself having to explain and educate, well, Haiti was colonized by XYZ countries, and then this is why, and then
hmm
great grandmother had, this
Yep.
color eyes and this type of hair, and this is where she came from, and then married. And it's just too much to explain. So I just say Haitian, and then I figure, if you're gonna do your education, do it on your own, but I'm not
Yes.
going to educate you.
No, absolutely. And so I've just said like I'll be so for me, I've even had friends be like, "Oh, I forget you're biracial sometimes." Because they're just like, if all
Right.
your friends are Black, they just assume they're, and that is kind of been a lot of my experience. That so
Right.
I'll say like in general, I just identify Black,
Right.
but like if I'm filling out forms, like to be correct, I do say two or more races. So I do say that, and I'll say like if it's Asian, I sub-identify Filipino, and then but I have traced like both sides back, and so um, on my father's side, I am a descendant of of enslaved people, individuals. So it's not like it's so I've in all the way back to a plantation in Virginia. So like I can tell like all of that in my history as well as like where my mom comes from in the Philippines, which the people in that area in the Visayan Islands tend to be darker because they're closer to the equator and it's hot. And so they
Right.
have adapted to living in those conditions. And so um, I feel like some people who've been exposed to
Right.
different cultures under they're like, "Oh, I could tell you were mixed. I could tell you were Asian." Like, I
Absolutely.
get that, but if that's not been your experience based on your skin color alone and your hair is kind of curly, it's not straight, I
Right.
do tend to get lumped into the Black category even as a child. So that's why I'm saying it's just, and then also with just even the friends, like having a lot of white friends. And then I got to junior high and they kind of, in high school, they didn't really know how to embrace me anymore because it's like, I don't know if it's okay, like if their group is mostly white kids, that they tended to go. So I had best friends that were, white. And then up until we got to junior high, where I was exposed to a larger Black population, then that's when I think the shift for me happened because my white friends
Mm.
really didn't hang out with me as much. And it was like, I'll say this, it wasn't like a formal argument or any conflict. I
Right.
think just as you see group think and you see people start to separate, they're like, this is cool, but you know, this is kind of how this group tends to look. And I'm like, okay. So, but I still hung out with everybody because I played sports. But I recognized early on that, like, oh, okay. So, like, being separated by your skin color is like a thing, like, is a thing. And yeah, I mean, I'm still friends with those people, but it's something that it was very clear, like a black and white line in the sand come high school, that
Right.
all my friends kind of became black, and then like all my close friends, and then the friends that I'd grown up with that were white, we talked here and there, but it wasn't as close as we used to be because of where their groups were now. So,
Right. Right. And do you think, when you think about intellectual empathy, can you
mhm.
bring us to a time when people could have been more empathetic, given the fact that even though, like you said, there was no argument or dispute, but there was still a line that was drawn where you
Mhm.
realized that maybe this is where I'll be more accepted.
Yeah, I think I have to give grace and that understanding that we were in high school, we're kids. I don't think we were thinking in that
Right.
way, like, oh, I'm going to go here and not realize I'm going to ostracize someone potentially. But
Of
I
course.
think, I think, as a young kid, we're taught like, sharing is caring, and just to be inclusive and like make sure
Right.
everybody's included in groups, which is funny because that's what we teach young kids. But then as we get into like junior and high school, it's like no one's there to say, hey, that's really kind of wrong that only the white kids are hanging together and only the black kids are hanging together. Maybe we should try to like be more inclusive of each other. And I think that's where I kind of always wondered, like, at what point do the adults, preparing us for those next stages in life, kind of step in to say, or have activities to encourage kids to kind of move and intermingle with other groups versus where you may feel comfortable, but also understanding you can gain perspective by learning from people from different backgrounds. So I think that's where I wish that would have been nurtured more versus like in college, you
Right.
can have a lot of those. You go to like a literature class or sociology class, those activities are more relevant to say, hey, I'm going to make sure everybody gets mixed up so you can learn about each other. That doesn't, I feel like in high school, it's like maybe it's too much of a social experiment, but I feel like I wish that would have taken place and been facilitated
Right.
um, by adults, because I think it's, when I think back, I'm curious, do I feel like I missed out on anything, or even my other like my white peers, do they feel like they missed out on something because they didn't get a chance to understand or
Right.
learn about the perspective from somebody else, and
Right.
vice versa for me. So,
Right. And do you think that when do you when did your social identity or or when were you cognizant that
yeah,
you actually became, oh, if this is how they see me, is this who I should associate myself as?
absolutely. I probably say ninth grade. I think I
Oh,
ran for freshman class president. And it was actually interesting enough. I ran against my best friend who was white from junior high and high school, junior high and late elementary school. We ran against each other. And it was very interesting because it ended up being myself and another black girl who was supposed to be vice president. And then here's my best friend running for president. And then she had a white peer running for her vice president. And so here we are running against each other. And I think at that point, there was like this racial divide, but also
yeah.
like people who are your allies. And there was stuff behind the scenes where like people would rip our posters up and like there's certain teachers that would say things like about, not thinking I would win just because, they had their passive aggressive ways of saying, you know, because if the white kids are more popular, like how do you expect to win? But again, I was friends with everybody, so it wasn't like that. I ended up winning, and I'll say that also that was a change. Um, but I think that's it. I realized at that moment that in that period when I was running and I won freshman class president, and I was the first freshman class president for that high school and the first black freshman class president, had they had they, they looked at it, And so I think that's what I'm saying. I think aligning myself at that point with that identity, because I realized it
Mm,
meant so much to that, to my community in that way. Like,
absolutely. Absolutely.
you know, and I think that is what I said, okay, I will be that, not necessarily token, but I will be that representative for my community. If this is the backing I get to overcome like these typical groups, or you know, this is what should be freshman class president or homecoming queen or whatever. So I feel like I took that on, and so I took on other leadership positions throughout my high school
Um,
career,
yep.
being the first in a lot of instances, um, because you know, unfortunately, it's kind of like no one would go against them, because it's like if you're the popular white kids, people not thinking they had a chance. But I didn't really look at it like that. I was like, I'm just gonna run on like my platform and thinking, hey, can I win or not? You know, based on what I'm advocating for.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there have been times where I was asked, like, I won a position. I think it was like vice president of student council, and I was asked by a white peer if I could, if we could redo the election, because his whole class, like, I guess it wasn't well advertised, so he didn't know, and a lot of people didn't really, wouldn't have voted the way they voted. You know, those kind of
That's
things were being
so
said.
subtle.
Yeah, so subtle, right? And I said, oh no. I said, nope. I no, we're not going to do that. And you know, I was like, that's not my, I was like, that's not my problem. And it's so funny because the teacher knew I was going to say no, but he's like, Holly, I'm going to leave it up to you. But he already knew where I was going. But I was just like, no. But those are the kind of things that, when you are the first, or just going to represent your community or go to bat for your community, I think that's why I say, like, I align myself, and my core group of friends are from the Black community. I tend to socialize in general with the Black community. A lot of the things that I advocate for the Black community. And it's not to say I don't also advocate for the Asian community, but I think my experience and my acceptance in that area has not been the same. Where just being fully embraced by my Black peers is just been
Normal.
more, yeah, known, more receptive. Like, it, they
Right.
don't ever really question
Ah,
where they don't question me, where it's like, why, like, where, for example, other like, even other Filipino, some of my other Filipino peers might be like, oh, are you, you know, or because I am darker, even my mom being darker, they'll be like, your mom's Filipino, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah. You know, like, there's a lot of history there. I don't know if you know, you know, so it's just one of those things that, yeah, so that's why I stand and I advocate. I never, again, if people ask, I do, how I identify, I, you know, absolutely let them know, but I do let people know I'm definitely pro Black and for my community. And so it's not to say I'm not pro Asian or pro uh, everybody having equity, but I think that's my main stance in general. And so, yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Christopher E. Lopez Sr., he says, I understand your growth. I'm a Black Cuban male. And he's asking how, oh, thank you so much for joining us. Christopher, I appreciate your comments. And he has a question for you, Holly. It's how does being biracial help you grow in your career?
Man, I guess when we talk about intersectionality and being able to navigate different spaces, I feel like, because I've had exposure compared to, say, maybe some of my Black peers who have not, like, growing up with white family members, and understanding, like, not to say generalize, like, all move that way, but I think I can say, oh, you know, they, I might, they might not be, they might be not be as understanding or be familiar with certain terminology or the certain history around Black Americans, you know what I mean? So I can go into situations being like, okay, that's not correct. You know, if I have to correct somebody, like, I know how to adapt my approach. And so I think that's kind of how I've approached it, is that being biracial, some people feel like, oh, you can navigate, like, oh, can you feel like it's, I don't feel like I code switch per se. I think it's more, I I try to put an empathetic like lens on things when I approach situations, just to say, "Ooh, okay, I think I get what you're trying to say. Let's rephrase that because it's coming off, it might be a little racist, or I can see the bias is coming through. Maybe that's not what you meant." But I try to approach situations thinking back to experiences that I've had, just to say, I think I know what you're trying to say, but this would be probably the best way to get that message across if you're trying to reach, Black peers, or if you're trying to relate to people, of a certain community. Like, I think that's how I say I've navigated my career in it. I'll still say, like, for the most part, people just assume I'm a woman of color, a Black woman. Like, they don't necessarily be like, what exactly are you? Like,
Right.
it's more, again, you're lumped into, I'm a woman of color. That is what I get lumped into. So it's interesting when people say, are you biracial? When it's like, but we have to also remember people are very visual.
Right.
So if you look a certain way, you're a woman, oh, but you're a woman of color. So boop, you're in that category. So sometimes I don't even get to really identify in that way. Like, oh, I'm biracial, by the way. Like, no, I just say, navigating my career with the being biracial in mind, I just try to think about the intersectionality and take into consideration that some people may not have the knowledge or the exposure to certain um, aspects of life for people, and so I have to be empathetic to that.
Of course. Of course. And do you find your mom being Filipino, how were you
Mhm.
raised at home? I have a couple of questions for you, but how were you
Yeah,
raised at home? And then you said you were adopted. So
yeah.
when you were raised at home, was it with both parents or more so your mom?
Okay,
How did it
both
work?
parents.
And then how did you build your confidence along the way?
Yeah, so basically the best way to describe it, and I say adopted because that's kind of, so it is like that. So my mother was already pregnant when with me when she met my dad, and my dad was the one that she ended up marrying was white. And so by the time I was born, um his name goes on my birth certificate. So in essence, he is my legal father. And so him being in the military, I assume all those, I get access to being American citizen, those rights. And so I am his legal child. And so I say adopt in that way because he already knew my mother was pregnant. Um, and she had a mixed race child at that point. That was, so that's how I say adopt. So I grew up in a home up until I was the age of 10 with a white dad and a Asian mother, and so Filipino mother. And so my mom would share things from the Philippines, whether it's food. She didn't necessarily teach us to Tagalog, or her language. I think it's now called Filipino. Um, but it's she and she still does, even with my own daughters. She'll say, okay, this is why we eat certain foods at this time of year. This is tradition. So she does share those, but just the same, being someone who immigrated to this country in the early 90s, um, she even had her fair share of people being like, oh, don't do that. Like, that's not American, or don't eat it that way. That's not very American. So she had her own, you know, feeling like she had to assimilate. And so because she felt like she had to assimilate, she's not teaching us to speak another language because she's being told that's not necessarily by my dad, but like by other people, like that's not American. You need to speak English, you know. And so even to this day, being raised in a second language home, I still interpret certain things for my mom or explain it to her in a way, or get on the phone for her if she needs me to explain it. But yeah, so at the age of 8, I asked my dad, I said, why am I different skin color from you? And
Ah,
he said, because I'm not, he told me, just, he said, I just walked up there and asked him, and he said, well, I'm not your blood dad. You have a different dad, but he's like, I love you the same. And so that was kind of the end of it. So he always acknowledged to me that he wasn't my biological dad. And then if I had questions about what it, what it means to be you know, like why is my skin color darker, being mixed race and understanding that. He was always open. I think it wasn't for me until I got into junior high where the conversations were like, hey, people are like are saying these things about my hair, about my skin color, and him actually learning to have to empathize and understand and do research because he's like, I'm raising a child that for all intents and purposes looks black for, especially
Absolutely.
we're looking like late 90s, early 2000s. And so there is no like racially ambiguous, like people are biracial, but it's like, if you are over, a certain skin tone, you got lumped into the black category.
Right.
And so there was a lot of conversations. Like I told him when I got called the N word,
Mm,
and it hurt my feelings. And he had to empathize. He's a white man in America. Like how do you even understand? And I mean, I talk about it like in my book, and just I've shared the story like on my YouTube channel, just him empathizing and him feeling hurt because he can't understand. That's never going to be his story. He's never going to be called the N word. But he doesn't like to see his child hurting, right? And so all he can do is just hold me and say, that's not right, and there are mean, evil people in this world, and all he can do is just provide comfort
absolutely.
and words. And so yeah, like I think that is that's all he could do. So I always appreciate my dad having the openness to listen and be selfless. And that's why I still believe that when it comes to allyship,
Yep.
I'm a big believer. I know those people exist that really do care and
Absolutely.
try to understand. And so I, um, yeah, like I don't know. I try to think like I was so blessed to have a father like that, that even though he's not my biological father, tried to understand where I was coming from. And then also if I had to correct him, that I'm
Ah,
like, yeah, because there have been those times where he's like, oh, that guy, like he'll say something, he's really dark. And it's like, no, 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 no. Like maybe in your eyes, he might be dark, but in the spectrum of the diaspora, no, he's not. Like I've had to even have those kind of like, you have to look at things in perspective, that if I have to put something on a color spectrum and say, really, he's not. There are people actually much darker. So don't say he looks dark. And so even having empathy to hear the accountability and the feedback that I'm giving him, just because he doesn't know. And as his child, I'm telling you, like, you're gonna be around me. You can't say those things. It's not appropriate, or, can offend somebody. And I don't ever want my dad, that's not his place or his intention. So of course I'm gonna teach him so he doesn't make those mistakes. And like he learned a lot from me. He had a black best friend and he didn't even understand because his best friend was so light. So light, like we call it very light skin
complexion. Yeah.
complexion. And he said, I really just thought you were white. And he's like, no, I'm black. And it was the funniest thing. And he's just like, and he said, I didn't, he's like, I never even, he's like, I'm so sorry. I didn't even ask. He's like, I assumed.
Mm,
And I said, and we had a conversation, and his best friend had a conversation with him, because you don't, like, again, if you're not exposed to it, you
right.
don't think about those things. And
Right.
so he's looking at it like, oh, I'm just talking to my best friend. I never thought to ask if he was black or white and what's his
Right.
history and his family. And so, yeah, there was a lot of that. Yeah, conversation. So that's why I said I take a lot of that into as I navigate corporate America, um, because I understand it's sometimes just it's not intentional, but you
Absolutely.
know, trying to be
Absolutely.
empathetic. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think what triggered me the most was your dad being so empathetic. I was like, oh, that's like unheard of.
Yeah. 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 He was a very he's a very sweet man. He passed away from cancer over 10 years ago,
Oh,
but
yeah.
so like February would have been 10 years. But like when I think about looking back on my life and being blessed to like understand and just be empathetic. Like that is a like people don't understand. Like I learned a lot of my empathy from him because I have to also think like here's and I always try to tell people understanding the context of time frames and history and when things are taking place. Like before, I always to say, you know, Dad, before these celebrities were adopting like Black children from like Africa and raising them, and like this was a thing. Like we were navigating a space in the early '90s into early 2000s where like
Right.
seeing a white person have a Black child that is not common. And living in Florida in the South, that's not a common thing to see. And so he had to, we moved around, like people really questioning and looking at us like real funny.
Of course.
Like, what is this? Like, okay. Like, and I would say, hey, dad, da da da, not even think about it, but realizing like white people and Black people being like, that's your dad? Like, you know, not understanding that at that time, like what that really meant. And so it wasn't until actually I got older that I'm like, I see it more now where white people will adopt Black children or I see more biracial children and they're very out and about proud about it, where it was like so different. 20 years ago, it wasn't quite that way. And I could tell when I was thinking back when I was younger, people would look at us and I feel like I could see they wanted to ask,
Right.
but didn't know how.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because it's still a very
Yeah.
it's still it again it's exactly what you said. They didn't know how to ask because they didn't want
Yep.
to come off rude or
Hmm.
racist. Nobody wants to be called
Yes.
a racist or have racial
Right.
ideas, which
Yeah.
some of us all do have, some
Yeah.
prejudices
Yes.
against people. But
Oh,
I think what happens is that those questions need to arise so that we can have better conversations.
yes. Hmm.
They definitely need to arise so we can have better conversations. Elijah Wright, thank you so much. He always comes and has these
Oh,
amazing questions for us. So he says, it's powerful to have the skill to be able to adapt to to adapt your approach. That's a prime example of being able to meet people where they are to help them move forward. Well done.
mm. That I love that. That's so well put and summarized. Yeah. Love that.
Right? And Christopher says something that's really interesting here. And I talk about this in other podcasts. It's so much to talk about
Sure.
when it comes to colorism.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's a big one. Colorism, I think, it's pervasive.
It is.
And it's in Latin American countries, in Caribbean countries, in
Mhm.
African countries. And it dates back from colonialism.
It does. Yeah. That's what I said.
It,
It's
it-
part of the
absolutely.
system. Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you said that there was like a divide in the sand, that's exactly what it
It
was. It's like, well,
was.
you don't look white, so you're not going to be with us.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Unintentionally, it just unconsciously that's just the route that it took.
Yes. It did. And it's interesting because I see it now and how they where those people have gone and grown up. And I'm thinking like we used to have like sleepovers together when we were like in elementary school. And now it's like we don't even talk. And I mean that's okay. Life change, you know, things happen. But it was just as I see the timeline of my life, like that is the line and that was the line in
Right.
the sand. And so yeah, it's just a I, I feel what I've observed within my own seeing my own kids experience that because I am seeing more mixed race children, whether it's biracial, multi-racial, however they identify. So I appreciate it. Um, but I do feel like back then it was like a choice. Like you almost like when people talk about I had to choose. I honestly feel like I made a like a
Conscious
conscious
decision.
choice, but it was definitely like you said unconscious because it was just like, well, if they're not going to make me feel included, well, I guess I'll go over here. So, yeah.
Absolutely. With the lens of intersectionality, are you better equipped to look for the collisions and intersections of power?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, um, and I'll say this because I think where some people may personalize it to a certain extent because they're like, "Oh, who could do that?" And I'm like, "No, let's look like I'm trying to I'll break it down for them like, "Hey, no, really look at it from this angle. This is probably why they're approaching it. If you were from their trying to get other like again, trying to see it from other perspectives because it's like and that's why I've learned to move more pragmatic about it because if I personalize everything, I'm sure I would be like, "Oh, see, they're only doing this because I'm um because this is happening or that." And I'm just like, no, I try to approach things pragmatic that everyone's going it with good intentions, with to collaborate, to mean well. Um, but again, also holding people accountable that when they do say things that are inappropriate or inaccurate, that I am saying, you can't say that. Here's why. Not to say I feel like it's my job to educate or tell you the history of things, but getting people to catch it when it's happening so they're aware. um that's also a part of it too, is that empathy is being like, "Ugh." I would hope someone would tell me if I was doing something wrong or not being appropriate, so I try to catch people when I can and give them
Absolutely,
that.
to be able to hold them accountable.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, they have to have some kind of accountability. Christopher asked something really interesting here. It says about colorism. I guess we have to do another show.
I think so.
How does skin tone bias affect racial equality when developing your DEI to HR work today?
Oh, that is so man, that's a really good question.
I know it's loaded.
And it's very loaded, and that's why I say I think that would be for another show in terms of how we break down, like, if as we talk about colorism and the systems that that impacts, as well as, um, skin tone bias, because I feel like that digs deeper into even our own communities as Black
Right.
people. And I think
Absolutely.
and I always say, like, I can't represent, I'm not of somebody who is on the who is darker of a darker skin tone, and I can't speak to what those experiences might be if you've been ostracized. And while my and I'm always trying to be inclusive and representative of all skin tones when I'm doing anything or posting anything if possible. So because I'm aware of the sensitivity around you know skin tone bias and you know what's out
Abs-
there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what would you want the audience to take away today?
Yeah, I would like the audience to take away that empathy is so important when it comes to DEI. Like when you're taking into consideration someone's personal experiences, how they identify, and recognizing that that people have multiple identities. Like when you think of how you identify yourself, not just on gender or race, but it might be you are living with a disability, or you are married to a veteran or have been a veteran. I think understanding that individuals are complex and having empathy to again meet them where they are. So that's one thing I always try to share with everybody, is that empathy, understanding, being an active listener can go so far when it comes to DEI work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been an amazing
Yes.
conversation. Where and how can everybody find you?
Yes. So you can find me on YouTube at So Please Understand. So some of the stories I shared today, you can find on my YouTube channel. So Please Understand. And you can find me on Instagram, find me on LinkedIn, and other social media under at Holly Noon. So just look me up and I'll, accept or see you follow me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank you all for listening. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We will share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag diversity connects us.